Well, last week we looked at Baal, the chief god over the pantheon of the ancient gods. He's also known as Zeus to the Greeks. And we discovered the evidence that this demon god has returned. First, he returned in the shadows in the 1700s, but then he stepped out of the shadows in the early 1900s as Nazi Germany attempted to conquer Europe, and with it came the Holocaust. And we noted how that the great altar of Zeus went on display in Berlin in 1930, the very same year that the rally grounds at Nuremberg were inaugurated, and that the great altar of Zeus was actually an inspiration for the pattern for the podium area that Hitler used for his speeches. Millions of all ages during that period of time were murdered, or should we say sacrificed. And we then briefly discussed the symbol of prosperity that has been associated with Baal for millennia, the molten bull, which was erected in the financial district in New York City. And we also discussed the massive replica of the Arch of Triumph that led to the Temple of Baal being put on display at City Hall in Lower Manhattan on September 19th of 2016. And it was also put on display in the capital cities of many other countries, and later it was put on display in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. Baal has come out of the shadows. And if we were to look back at the 1960s, we would find that it was then that he began to step forward and back into the public square. What happened in the 1960s that signified he was no longer content to remain in the shadows? It was something we didn't mention last week, but need to quickly give it a bit of time, look at it for a time frame of events. See, the Bible and prayer were removed from schools during the 1960s. Madalyn Murray O'Hair began her assault against the church and Christianity. And if you were to look back at what took place then, one easily comes to the conclusion she had become possessed by Baal. And so we have the time frame for Baal when Baal stepped out of the shadows and back into the public square and began his attack on Western civilization as prayer and the Bible were removed from schools. You see, if you would, America and Western civilization was in the process of forgetting God and abandoning worshiping Him. And if America, along with all of the Western civilization began turning away from God in the early 1960s, and Baal began coming out of the shadows, we would expect Ashtoreth or Ishtar to follow close behind. And today, we're going to begin to look at the female goddess, demon of the detestable Trinity, Ashtoreth. The interesting thing is, even though Baal was the chief of the gods of the ancient pantheon, this goddess or demon was the most potent and oldest as far as when people began to actually worship her. She's found in the culture of ancient Sumer, which predates the rise of the worship of Baal and Molech in the Middle Eastern countries we know of as Canaan. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon in Judges 6, and tells him that he is going to give Gideon victory over the Midianites, and that it will be through him that Israel will be saved from the Midianites, as he became one of the judges to be raised up after God had punished His people and given them into the hands of the Midianites. And the first thing God tells Gideon to do is found in Judges chapter 6, if you would. That same night the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." He is to tear down the altar of Baal, and then there is this Asherah pole that is beside the altar that he is to tear down. And if you were continuing to read, he's told to use it for firewood for the purpose of offering a burnt offering to the Lord on a proper altar that is to be built in place of the altar to Baal or Baal. It is a pole erected to this goddess demon known as Ashtoreth. And we've mentioned before, she is also known as Ishtar to the Babylonians, Aphrodite to the Greeks, and Venus to the Romans. And notice, the pole was erected next to the altar of Baal. You see, worshiping Baal and Ashtoreth together was common. We read in Judges 3, if you would. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Asherahs is the plural form for the many versions of Ashtoreth, just like there were many versions of Baal. So why were they worshipped simultaneously so often? Well, if you were to go back through your ancient history and look at what we have tended to call myth, which we have discovered wasn't really myth, these were demons that were being worshipped, actual beings, you would find, if you would, Ashtoreth was Baal's wife or consort, depending upon which version was being worshipped. And as a result, it was so important among the gods, she was so important among the gods that she was also called, if you would, the Queen of Heaven. And by the time we get to the period of Jeremiah, the Israelites are also calling her by that name. We read in Jeremiah 7, if you would, the children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough and make cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to arouse my anger. So they worshipped her right alongside of Baal from the very beginning of their turning away, just like the Canaanites had done and were doing. For instance, we remember Elijah and the people of Israel on Mount Carmel. Very well-known story for most Christians. And what do we remember? Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal. And it was there that a battle took place between Baal and God. I mean, we read through there about him making fun of the prophets of Baal, jeering at them as they're cutting themselves. Well, maybe he's asleep, or maybe he's gone to relieve himself, or he's gone on vacation or something. But let's look again at what Elijah tells them to do prior to this confrontation, if you would. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. It wasn't just the prophets of Baal. It was also the prophets of Ashtoreth or Asherah. And the text seems to focus on Baal and his prophets from that point on, but they are told to also summon the prophets of Asherah in that passage. So remember, Baal is defeated and his prophets are killed by the end of the chapter. But what did we learn last week? Baal was the chief god or demon of the pantheon. So, if you would, when you defeat Baal, you defeat all the gods, including Ashtoreth. And so when they killed the prophets of Baal, which were focused on because he was the chief of the gods, then they also killed the prophets and prophetesses of Ashtoreth. Okay, so what does ancient history tell us about Ashtoreth? As we go through this, look for some things to jump out as you that might be something that you see going on around us today as we look at the characteristics of Ashtoreth. Because some of these things, there's going to be key words through here that are kind of going to be a reflection of what we see today. So, and let me preface what we are going to learn by saying her influence is more pronounced today than that of Baal. In this day and age, right now, in the world around us today, especially in the culture of America, her influence is more pronounced right now than that of Baal. So look for some things to jump out at you, certain words that describe her or phrases as we go through and look at her characteristics. So let's get a closer look at this ancient demon goddess and find out what she was like and see how it applies to what's going on in civilization today. There are several characteristics of Ashtoreth, also known as Aphrodite. She was known for breaking the rules, going against the norms, going against the gods. She would threaten the gods if they didn't give her what she wanted. If she didn't get things her way, she would threaten. She stole the god's sacred possessions. Her Greek name, Aphrodite, gives us an obvious clue as to one of her characteristics. She was a seductress, the goddess of sexuality. In some ancient civilizations, she was connected to the sun and to the moon. The Romans associated her with another celestial light, which is commonly seen in the early morning, just as the sun is rising, or in the early evening, just as it is setting, the planet Venus. You've heard women are from Venus, men are from Mars. That's where that comes from. And as such, the planet Venus is associated with love. So if you would, she was the goddess of prostitution and was herself a prostitute. She was the wife of Baal, but never faithful to him. She was the patron goddess of the taverns and made her home there, where she mixed sexuality with drunkenness. She would tempt and allure and snatch the souls of all who embraced her. She was often portrayed naked and in provocative poses. She is found even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, trying to seduce the story's hero, who responded by spurning her advances. And she was often portrayed with her symbols, the moon or crescent, the sun, and her star, which was associated with the planet Venus. And we'll talk more about this shortly. She was also known as the god of war. She is vindictive and given to rage. She would become vengeful and violent and would wreak havoc and destruction if she did not get what she wanted or was offended. And she was often portrayed as the god of war with weapons and entering into combat. And the association with the lion is probably because of that characteristic. She was fierce, impetuous, impulsive, hyper-emotional, demanding, tempestuous, extremely carnal, greedy, romantic, full of unbridled passion, insatiable sexual desire, and boundless pride. She was also the goddess of enchantments or magic spells. And obviously, love magic was her specialty. If you would, it was an enchantment that spawned uncontrollable desire or that altered one's affections and behavior. She possessed her worshippers and seized them. Her priestesses served as her vessels through whom she spoke and worked. Worship of Ashtoreth was filled with carnality and explicit sexuality. And her temples appeared to be nothing more than houses of prostitution, according to the descriptions in the ancient writings. As we said, she was known as Ishtar to the Assyrians, Babylonians, and much of Mesopotamia. And evidence suggests that the Babylonian kings would go to her temple and perform ritual sex acts with her high priestess every year on the 10th day of the Mesopotamian New Year festival of Akitu. It's debated as to whether or not it was symbolic or literal, but considering all we know about her, it was probably literal, and her high priestess served as her sexual surrogate. And according to the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, this ritualized temple sex was not limited to kings and high priestesses. Every woman of the land was required to sit in the temples of the goddess and become a temple prostitute and have sexual relations with strangers in exchange for money at least once in her lifetime. And this is what gave rise to the ancient sacred sex, or temple prostitution, or cult prostitution, and the sacred prostitute. We're familiar with the debauchery of the ancient pagan world through many of the writings that we've read and things we've learned in school and so on, and even what we see in the Scriptures. But these specific acts with the kings and so on, these acts went beyond what we know of the debauchery of the ancients and were described as disgraceful by the ancient writers who were familiar with the temples, which says a lot about the depravity of her followers, especially in the region of Mesopotamia where she was known as Ishtar. Then, when the gospel began to spread across the Roman Empire, an age where the covenant of marriage was sacred and sexuality was seen as a gift that was given exclusively to that covenant arose. Ashtoreth, also known as Inanna, Ishtar, Aphrodite, and Venus, among many others, was driven out of the public square and into exile, along with Baal and the many other pagan demon gods and the demigods. So, has Ashtoreth also stepped out of the shadows along with Baal? She most definitely has. Not only was the Bible and prayer removed from the public schools in the 1960s, if you would, the sexual revolution began in the 1960s. It leaped vividly onto the scene with Woodstock. The age of free love began to make its way into the public square. And a new generation began to rise up that would no longer hold marriage as sacred, and sexuality was no longer a gift reserved for marriage. The belief that if it feels good, do it began to take over the mindset of that young generation and would be passed down to the generations that followed. And we have witnessed exactly what we would expect taking place around us today. Debauchery and depravity of the ancient pagan world leaving the shadows was now being glorified in the public square once again. If you would, this demon goddess's purpose is to cast her spell and lead a civilization that embraces Christian biblical morality to turn away from those values and embrace paganism, the worship of demons. So let's take a look at what else we know about Ashtoreth or Ishtar. And as we do, let's look at a short list of words that hopefully popped out at you along the way that the ancients used to describe the characteristics of Ashtoreth or Ishtar that we probably, hopefully, like I said, have noticed. Vengeful and violent, easily offended, impetuous, impulsive, hyper-emotional, demanding, romantic, tempestuous, and if you would, extremely carnal, full of unbridled passion, insatiable sexual desire, boundless pride, steals sacred possessions of other gods, and warrior. Wow, those pretty much sum up Western civilization today. So what else do we know about Ashtoreth, or as we will refer to her many times, Ishtar? As Ishtar of the Babylonians, her depravity became even more pronounced, as we've already noted. She would cross boundaries and break down taboos and embrace everything that was once abhorrent. If you would, she took sexual immorality and elevated it to being God. Remember, we noted that Ishtar is in many ways a mirror or reflection of the great prostitute in Revelation that represents the world. Do you remember how John described her in Revelation? If you would. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. You see, in an ancient hymn to Inanna, Ishtar is found, if you would, the pearls of a prostitute are placed around your neck. Rivka Harris in the chapter Inanna Ishtar as Paradox and a Coincidence of Opposites in his book History of Religions quotes an ancient writing where Ishtar says, if you would, I am a prostitute. And we have witnessed prostitution move from the shadows to commonality in the decades following the 1960s until now. It's common. And we have seen the move from TV shows and movies not even showing a married couple in the same bed to showing anything is allowed and it's celebrated in the bedroom. Ancient world history writings are filled with the sacred hymns or writings to Ishtar and Inanna, in which she is described as a prostitute. The Greek word for writing, if you would, is graphos. And the Greek word for prostitution is, if you would, porne. And from the Greek word used to refer to these writings and hymns of worship to her, we get the two terms combined in our modern word, if you would, pornography. But there's still more. Ishtar's enchantments were intoxicating. She was the patron goddess of bars and taverns. She caused her followers to abandon reason and rationality to do what they otherwise would never have considered doing. You see, if you would, her goal was to alter the conscious mind. American alcohol consumption suddenly began rising at the end of World War II and continued for 2 decades when the sexual revolution burst onto the scene. And while alcohol consumption and alcoholism would continue to increase, a new escalation would begin in the 1960s, which also continued to escalate until this very day. If you would, drug abuse. The most popular of these new intoxicating substances were the psychedelic or mind-altering drugs that radically altered perception, thinking, and behavior. The altered consciousness is now glorified and desired. Sexuality, intoxicating substances, and music that excited the senses, all three were dominant in the temples of Ishtar and the worship of her. The music was of a type that resulted in the worshipers engaging in a type of dancing that reflected lewd movement and sensual gyrations. And sadly, worship in many churches today has begun to look much like the worship that took place in the temples of Ishtar, and in some cases has become blatantly pagan. Worship in those temples embraced the concept of personal expression. The idea of expressing oneself in worship was embraced and encouraged as a form of worship to the goddess. And yet there's still another aspect to Ishtar, if you would. She had the ability to transform individuals, nations, and the culture of civilizations sexually. Combine that with her ability to alter the conscious mind, and what would you expect to see? Well, to the Romans, she was known as the morning star, but also the evening star, the goddess Venus, which reflected the duality of her nature. Remember our list of words and phrases concerning her character and nature? Well, let's look at that list again, but in a different order. If you would. Romantic, impetuous, impulsive, hyper-emotional, tempestuous, extremely carnal, full of unbridled passion, insatiable sexual desire. These are a reflection of the goddess, note, I say, goddess of love. But the other terms, if you would, vengeful and violent, easily offended, demanding, warrior. These are a reflection of the god of war, also known as Ashtoreth or Ishtar. Do you see it? If you would. The first part of the list has characteristics that are associated with femininity, and the latter with masculinity. She has both a feminine nature and a masculine nature. And admittedly, some of them are characteristics of both natures. This connection to both femininity and masculinity was more than allusion or metaphor. Remember, she is the patron goddess of bars and taverns. The ancient Sumerian text, Al-Shir-Namshub to Inanna, I don't speak Sumerian, quotes the goddess as saying, if you would, when I sit in the alehouse, I am a woman and I am an exuberant young man. Another ancient Sumerian text, Inanna and Ebi, records her as saying, if you would, though I am a woman, I am a noble young man. And this was the heart of what Ishtar in her various forms was all about. Masculine and feminine in one being. Turning a man into a woman and a woman into a man. If she wanted to be a woman, she'd be a woman. If she wanted to be a man, she'd be a man. The ancient Sumerian hymn to her, a hymn to Inanna for Ishme-Dagon, says that she has the power to, if you would, turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man, to change one into the other. So, what would happen when this demon began to move out of the shadows and break out into the public square? The definition of male and female would be altered. There would be a rise of a cancel culture. Ah, sound familiar? The lines between male and female would first be blurred, and then the distinctions between the two would be nullified or canceled. If you would, the nature of man and woman would be transformed, exactly what they're trying to do today. All that is male would be feminized, and all that is female would be masculinized. Men would be turned into women, and women into men. The sanctity of sexuality and gender would be assaulted and warred against by confusing the two and merging the one into the other and the other into the one, and eventually cancel them both. On the fringes of society, in the shadows, is where it would begin. Next, it would come into the mainstream step by step until it flooded every part of culture, until virtually no part of life would be untouched. It would be the doorway for the next stage of civilization's paganization. And it would become the primary weapon used to smash and cancel the biblical foundations of Western civilization. Prior to the gods being driven out by the spread of the gospel, the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they might do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. As it was in the time before the spread of the gospel, which drove out the ancient demon gods, so it is that civilization today has abandoned God and become pagan, just like ancient Israel. Next week we'll look at the events that have ushered Ashtoreth or Ishtar back into the public square, so that we get a better understanding of what's going on around us. Because like we said, in order to be able to fight your enemy, you've got to know your enemy and how your enemy thinks and acts. And we are at war. And the war is escalating. And we'll take a deeper look at Ashtoreth next week, and perhaps even move on into looking at Moloch. But part of fighting that battle is being willing to go and be what God wants us to be wherever He may send us. As He opens doors, as He provides opportunities, to be willing to walk through those doors and take advantage of those opportunities as we strive to take the truth of the gospel to the world around us. Are you prepared to go where He leads you? Are you prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that He may place in front of you? Would you embrace those opportunities today?